that's what a plan. Okay, you ready? That's great. Okay, we're all here. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, that's as soon as you said Weebles, I go, man, that sounds familiar. That's where I had to get my shoes repaired in the basement of Weebles back in the 50s. Okay. That's amazing. Oh, I worked there all the stuff, okay. I used to wrap the shoes in front, and they like black, brown paper. Yeah, I used to wrap it and then put them up there. Exactly. And the ticket, yeah, exactly. I remember that stuff. Yeah. Oh, it is? Oh, maybe, yeah. I don't know if you were. And we are recording now.
Mike, could you tell me what it was like growing up in your household?
Yes, I think I always thought it was regular because I assumed everybody else did the same thing. I had a mother and a father and a brother and a sister and lived in a regular house and went to Catholic school and went to church a lot and ate Italian food as well as American food. And so Sunday dinners were antipasto and soup and pasta and a roast and potatoes and salad and an American dessert and an Italian dessert.
Who was the first generation of your family to come to Chicago, and why did they come here?
Okay, they all came to what they called, and it seems to be throughout all the branches of the family, they came to the miracle. They always called America Il Miraculo. They came to get rich and to improve their situation. And then later, they imported Italians. The ones who came here, all of my family came being able to read and write. They all, as far as I can tell, did very, very well in this country, and they all were anxious for education and for status, and they brought Italians from Italy to marry their daughters, and some of those people were aristocrats. The girls all got substantial dowries. In the drugstore behind me, 2 young pharmacists who didn't have a lot of money married 2 rich girls who were sisters, and they each got a building and a business when they started. That was pretty much the tradition. My mother's father was given a hospital when he came here. They recruited him from Italy, and he was given Columbus Hospital by my great-grandfather and John Cuneo's great-grandfather. So they bought the Lakeside Hotel and started him up in Columbus Hospital, and then he brought Mother Cabrini here. So we've done very well in this country. Indeed, it has been the miracle. They all came for prosperity. One interesting story, one Gerardo Serritella was a sort of a game warden in Italy. He was a crop counter and a sort of agent on an estate. In Italy, game was strictly controlled. You can't take game from the land of a seigneur, of a landowner. He heard that in America anyone could take any game he wanted. He was drawn to America. He came here to be a hunter. On the way over in the boat, he became a professional letter writer. He never left that. The high point of his professional life was he became a notary public in Chicago. From that point on, when he was 65, he was always dressed as Il Notario. He's buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery on the main avenue, where his son, who was a physician, buried him. Another great-grandfather of mine, a great-great-grandfather of mine, whose name was DeStefano, came here and began as a saloon keeper. He sent his eldest son to Northwestern Law School, and Rocco DeStefano was law partners with Clarence Darrow. So they followed the very same route that everybody else did when he came to this country. They worked very hard and set abundant tables and sent their children to the best private schools. Also, my entire generation had orthopedic shoes, piano lessons, braces, whether you needed it or not, and all the American things that are tied to status. So I think that's what America is about, and that's certainly what my family was about. It's been a very good run for 160 some years. We've been very happy here.
Tell me about we were talking about
What was that next question? Do you want to give this mic down?
Yeah.
Bruce?
Okay.
And 3, 2, 1, 6.
Mike, we talked a lot about the relationship between your family and the the Cuneo family and other prominent Italian families. Can you talk about that?
There were three Genoa families that came to Chicago. My great-grandfather and I think it was one of the Lavazorios and one of the Cuneos. They all arrived at the same time. They all were millionaires in reasonably short time. But it happened a great deal because they were very hardworking and very enterprising. And they came from Genoa, which was a port place. The Cuneos were better off. They brought chestnuts to this country and were in the fruit and nut business. Lavazorios were also in the fruit and nut business. Boito was essentially a landlord. He married an Italian woman whose name was Cecilia Brizolara. He recruited her from the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Genoa, and they lived in what's now called Old St. Patrick's Parish, but was then New St. Patrick's. All the girls went to Sacred Heart. They went to Sacred Heart on Taylor Street and then in Lake Forest. The first Genoa families who were here were dead serious about their religion. The two were dead serious about business. My family were dead serious about the professions. They all went to school, and they all became doctors and lawyers, and they recruited doctors and lawyers from Italy. And the Southern Italians came somewhat later, although we had a relative who came not very much after the Civil War. The boost to those people who came to Chicago and did so well were three things that happened at once. One was the coming of the railway. The second thing was the American Civil War, and it was before the time of Andrew Jackson when the spoils system got a bad name. So Abraham Lincoln indeed pointed business to Illinois when he could, because that was where he was from. And then the third thing that helped enormously is the opening of the West. When 1 million Union soldiers went west, all the people who were in Chicago, if they were enterprising, they did well. Well, all those people and all the other people that I know about also did well by the growth of Chicago. And Chicago had enormous and rapid growth at each of those junctures, the railway, the Civil War, and then the post-Civil War opening of the West. So all of those things were very good things. And of course with it came bigger houses, more help, more Catholic schools and more private schools, and a great deal of what I think is very fortunate circumstance and very good living.
Describe a bit about the Cuneo family. We've had some conversations about the Cuneo family. Were there any family get-togethers?
There were more connections, and the one connection that we had they had stopped getting servants from Italy, so they got them from Slovenia. And the connection that we had is Vilma Hobson, who raised my mother and then assisted in the raising of me and my sister and my brother, was the daughter of Louise, who was the nanny for one of the Cuneo children, and she's buried with them. There was a widower in the Cuneo family. What's interesting, too, is John's father went to Yale, and it so happens that my wife's uncle was there at the same time, and they knew each other. Again, America is such a small place. And Bob Crow, who was the state's attorney during the Loeb and Leopold trials, was married to one of the Cuneo girls. And my uncle, my mother's sister's husband, was his first assistant state's attorney when they prosecuted Loeb and Leopold. And of course, just recently they were publishing, there was a special on Channel 11 about Loeb and Leopold. And of course, as they're showing it, there's my grandmother sitting in the front row, because her brother was participating with Bob Crow, with Judge Crow, who later became Judge Crow, but then State's Attorney Crow, in the prosecution of the Loeb and Leopold. Also, my grandmother had sent her children to the University of Chicago, and they knew Loeb's at the University of Chicago. So the whole Chicago is a very small and connected sort of city, and happily so. People are happy to see each other and renew those acquaintances. And also the charity thing worked very well. All the churches in Chicago, everybody was loyal to those churches. November the 10th, we're going to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which my family has been connected with for 150 years, if I can. That's just seemed. I know that isn't long in terms of Europe, but in terms of here in the middle of the prairie, 150 years is a very long time.
Talk about the importance of religion in your family. It seemed like it was very common to coming to America and continuing your religious practices.
It was one of the things they really held on to. It saved them. The girls all were expected to get to the altar in white, and as far as I know, they did. They were also expected or hoped, it was hoped that they would marry Catholics, and by and large, in my family, certainly prior generations, they all did marry Catholics. And then the idea of the public school, my great-grandfather said that he had children, and he had 10, that he did not expect anybody else to educate them. He expected that that would be his responsibility. And a lot of the things I'm telling you are things I was told rather than I can verify, but I suspect they're true. He was Carlo Botto. He was a martinet and a very dominating with his children. At one point, they asked him to join the Union League Club, and he said, "Why would I join your club?" And they said, "Well, you could come and meet people." He said, "I don't want to go a place where there are women who aren't my wife, and I don't want my children going there either." And he said, furthermore, and they said, well, they could help him in business. He said, "I have 1,000 fruit trees in Melrose Park and 10 children who come every day to dinner and do what I tell them. There's nothing that you can possibly do for me." So, of course, he didn't join. But his children were very excited about joining the Union League Club, so they bought the American way of living.
Was it easy for families, speaking of your parents and your grandmother, was it easy for them to be accepted into more of a prominent WASP society, let's say?
Chicago was not so waspy. First of all, Bertha Palmer, who had been Bertha Honore, who was Potter Palmer's wife, went to Sacred Heart on Taylor Street with my grandmother. So they were chums, and I don't think it was difficult for them. On the other hand, they weren't laying bricks and they weren't working on the street. You know, they were very careful to make sure they preserved their distinction by high education, and they were very competitive in school. My mother's eldest brother was first in his class in the first class of internal medicine coming out of county. My grandfather was at the same time as he was a very prominent physician, he also was chairman of the park board in Chicago. Maybe he wasn't chairman, but he was on, and he did indeed name Columbus Park. And the reason he named Columbus Park, Columbus is who else do the Italians have? They named everything they could after Columbus. So the two hospitals, which are now Columbus and Mother Cabrini subsequently closed, those were both named Columbus, and then Grandpa named Columbus Park. So they did not have a hard time. I'm sure there were places where they were not welcome. If there were, they didn't know about that. They were welcome in the Catholic school, and they were welcome in the professional places they went. They were welcome to office at 30 North Michigan. So the places that they chose to go, they were welcome at the country clubs they cared to join, and also at the Lakeshore Club before Northwestern took that building. So they were quite comfortable being here in Chicago and being in America. I can't remember ever a story of hearing that they were excluded from anything. And my father and his brother went to the University of Chicago, where they were welcomed and quite comfortable. So I don't know where they would have gone that they wouldn't have been, or where that would have been a bar or a detriment. But I was aware that comments were made, and I heard the words. Everybody heard the words Dago and WAP and things like that. I just didn't think it was very important, and I didn't think that people who were worthwhile talked like that. And I don't think people do today either. I don't think people use those words.
Were you aware that there was, really your family was part of an earlier immigration, more businessmen, people coming over here and becoming successful, and then there was the masses, the poor masses also that came. Did you find that was there any mixing between these groups?
There was not so much mixing, and there was a different. There was somewhat of a different culture. I knew that we were well off for a long time in the sense that life had been easier. I also understood from a very early age, because we were told that what the difference was with school, and that you better attend to it, because otherwise you'd be left. These other things would happen to you. You'd have to. And my father was always teaching us object lessons. These are things nobody here might remember, and even people on film. My father took us to the slums at Christmas time. My sister and I assumed that people who did poorly in school wound up in that situation. We got the message. And of course, the one of the stories I told you, which I think is a wonderful story, I remember the day that Cabrini Green was opened, and it was Mayor Daley, the father of this mayor, did this as a gift to the Italian people. And Mother Cabrini was the first Italian saint. My sister and I drove with my father to Melrose Park to pick out 2 trees that we got to plant. And then we went to Cabrini Green at Division and Franklin, I guess it is, and we planted the trees, and we had mass, and we had cakes, and we visited with Mayor Daley, and it was and there were a great many poor people that lived there, and a lot of them were also the product of unfortunate situations. The last cardinal, Joe Bernardine, when he was here, his father was a stone cutter, which was a very respected and well-paid. His father died right after they got to America. He would have been one of those people, had he been in Chicago, who would have been in Cabrini Green. There were people whose fathers died, and their situation was unfortunate. We didn't have that kind of thing happen to us, so we were blessed in that respect. And we were always grateful about it. None of my cousins thought this is just something that happens. We thought this is something that happens because people provide and work hard, and because there's this wonderful place called Il Miraculo.
Do you remember growing up with opera? Was opera an important part of your upbringing?
It was something that came to me later, but my grandparents, it was very important. Theater and opera was very important to my grandparents, more so than to my parents. But there were a lot of dress-up things. There were also a lot of Italian organizations that involved formal dinner dances in the winter. So I remember many times my parents getting dressed up to go to formal parties. And now my mother told us wonderful stories. They lived in a big double brownstone on Washington Boulevard at 2929 West Washington Boulevard, and with a ballroom on the third floor. And when Caruso would come, she and her sister, her older sister, who was still young, Virginia, it would be their job. The musicians would come and throw wax on the dance floor, and they would have to spread the wax around with sort of slippers on or something to make the floor slippery so that people could dance. Because in those days, I've forgotten what the dances were, but Mother said about that. And then she and her sister would look over the railing while people came, and it was all very. And Potter Palmer would come, and Palmers were very nice people. And before Mrs. Palmer moved to Europe, she was very easy and accessible, and very anxious to show the collection that was on the drive in her house and so on. So opera was very important to us. The lyric is very important to us now. We kid that we have these wonderful seats and that we'd keep them if we were homeless. We would never give up the seats.
That's a good story. Do you think that I sort of asked this of you earlier, but was it important to assimilate a bit to become accepted and just sort of accept the American ways, or to maintain some of your Italian identity?
I think I joked as we went to on a trip to Italy. We researched our ancestors, and we went all the way back to 300, and we found a guy, Marcus Furius Camillus, who had stayed a pagan long after the Italians, or the Roman Empire. He was a Roman general, but he stayed a pagan long after the Roman Empire became Christian. And I thought to myself at the time, I thought, this is our family. They never let go of anything. So, of course, they held on to all this Italianness, and there were things they didn't want to assimilate, and they didn't want to do about America. And I told you about the expression, Managgia America. There were things that they rejected about the American culture. The last to go was divorce. They were, you just stayed in a situation. You married somebody, that was it. You made your decision. And my poor sister, who got divorced, when she came home, my mother couldn't understand why she wasn't content to just stay at home. And my mother said to her many, many times, you had your life. Well, my mother's attitude was, if you got married and you got divorced, that was the end of it. You didn't go and find somebody else. So that there were a lot of things about America that were rejected. Today, I still reject the cruelty of the language in the popular culture, and I'm shocked that people say shut up to their parents. I am shocked that people use bad words in front of their parents. I can't imagine, and we grew up on the west side in Oak Park and River Forest, where there were a fair number of children, or some children, whose parents were in organized crime. Those children did not behave the way that the people on television do. They were also polite, religious, and never would have done things. Once when I was at the University of Chicago, a friend of mine said to me, he wanted to marry someone, and he said his father told him he couldn't. And he said, well, what would you do if your father told you couldn't marry this person? I said, are you nuts, Gary? I wouldn't marry them. If my father said I couldn't marry them, that would be the end of it. And that was pretty much how I felt growing up, and I know that those things have changed. On the other hand, I think people generally in my family still don't marry people that their parents would think were unsuitable. Now, that doesn't mean they have to come from grand origins, but it means they have to have serious intent and be decent and not be, bad people. The other thing we did not have, which I think is also part of the culture, I had not seen excessive use of alcohol or drugs. I think that's something that was despised when I was growing up, but now it's become mainstream in America. So we got the good with the bad. I'm enchanted and thrilled and grateful every day to be here and so on, but I don't buy the whole package. Does anyone? From wherever he comes, does anyone buy the whole package?
Who was your biggest role model when you were growing up?
Oh, my father. Who else? My father was a lawyer and also thoughtful and intellectual, a history person. He was he went to the university, to U High with his brother, and they went from 2 years of high school right to the University of Chicago, into the university. And my father won a 4-year scholarship to the University of Chicago for a history essay, and he competed against people who had college degrees, and so he was, in a sense, a great hero. And he was very thoughtful, and he was always a reader. And we read everything. Now I read a great deal of mystery novels and so on, but my father read everything, and I thought that's how everybody was. And I assumed that everybody, after dinner, sat down and read. I found out subsequently that's not true. My father also said, he said a lot of very quotable things. He said about juries, which I think is interesting, he said juries don't decide whether you're innocent or guilty, they decide whether you need to be punished. He also said that in America things were very, very good, and that probably there was no place else where it was as good as it is here, and that we should keep that in mind. And he always was keenly interested in American history and politics, and I'm fascinated with the American political drama, and so I don't miss any of it. And so, but there were a great many things. He also told us that if he were the last person on Earth and he was in the desert and there was no one within any distance from him from the stars and a light turned red, he'd stop. And of course, I understood what he was telling us at that time. You obey the rules and you function within the boundaries. And so I think those are good lessons.
Tell me about your grandfather. One of the things, after we have 4 minutes left, I'm going to take more
Okay.
change tapes, but he was one of the founders of the White Hand Society.
He was grandfather, my mother's father, whom she always talked of as Papa, and as if he were still alive, but he wasn't. He was a great man. He went to the University of Naples, which was not altogether unusual for physicians to go to. It was before the Johns Hopkins study here. He then went to Bologna, and he spent time with Pasteur in Paris. My theory is that he knew he was coming to America to marry a rich girl because he was on the market. Boito and I think it was one of the Ligorios. Anyway, they kind of recruited him. He came from Italy. He came to their house. The girls were sitting sewing in the dining room, and they had not sewn for a long time. There was help in the house. But the girls were sitting sewing. The boys were introduced to them, and then they went and signed papers to say they would marry them. And this was a sort of approval of the American process where there was a sort of courtship. This was defined as courtship. They met the girls. And then my grandmother and my grandfather kept company for some time before they were married. The Lakeside Hotel was converted to Columbus Hospital. And then Grandpa, one of the things that his father-in-law bought for him was 1 wagon and 2 teams of horses. And the reason for the 2 teams of horses was they worked constantly. He delivered babies. He went to the hospital at 5 o'clock in the morning. He did grand rounds at 9 o'clock, and he went to his office on Taylor Street after that. He was the doctor for the Armours, and he delivered the Armour children. And then my mother was named after Lolita Armour because Grandpa and Lester were very good friends. So he was in all things a great man, and he was also a great I think he was a person of very good, if I can rely on my mother and the people who knew him, he was a person of great fellowship. He enjoyed company and so on. He had he had horse races, and he had a heart attack and a stroke at the racetrack in Florida, and near Palm Beach, and then he was sick for some time, and then he died, of course. But the memory of him lived on, and of course he shaped his 6 children. 2 of them were physicians. 1 was a banker. And then the 3 girls, 2 of the girls married. One married one of the Foxes who had a beer company, and the other one, my mother married, of course, a lawyer. And then the 3rd one married another lawyer who was the one who was the assistant state's attorney with Bob Crow. So as I say, it's been a very good run, but in a sort of narrow formula. I mean, they didn't branch out and do anything extraordinary. They followed pretty much a regular formula. Most of them went to Northwestern Law School. Some went to the University of Chicago. They went to the University of Chicago undergraduate school. And then my mother's eldest brother was dean of the medical school at Stritch and was Cardinal Stritch's doctor, and they were very close. So, okay. Okay. Tell me if I'm talking too much.
Okay, that sounds good.
All set?
Okay. Michael, your grandfather was one of the founders or founded the White Hand Society. Can you talk about what the...
Yes, in Chicago there were a group of Sicilians, and they belonged to a thing called the Unione Sicilioni. So there were the head of the Unione Sicilioni was Mike Merlo, and he was part of the Black Hand, and they threatened people and extorted them. Well, when they were building Mother Cabrini Hospital, Lakeside Hotel became Columbus Hospital, but Mother Cabrini Hospital, which was also called Columbus, on Lytel near Our Lady of Pompeii, when the nuns were building the hospital, the Unione Sicilioni wanted to take tribute from them of some sort. Mother Cabrini, who was a character and a half, she was trained as a school teacher in Italy. She came here. And of course, the myth in this country is that we have a separation of church and state. But the fact is that Roman Catholics, and especially religious in garb and so on, moved back and forth across the ocean without any problems at all. No one ever examined them or asked them any questions. They just came and went. So Mother Cabrini came to Chicago to staff the hospital that Grandpa had founded and that he was running, and that his son ran after him, and the younger son ran after they relinquished control of it. And the nuns were given the hospital, and they were given the land by Frank Cuneo and by Carlo Botto. They wrote the checks that got these businesses started, or these hospitals started, long before Medicare. So when they were threatened by the Black Hand, Grandpa founded the White Hand Society, and they had a bunch of Italians in Chicago, Cuneos, Cesros, Lavazorios, the old Genoa families, but also a great many, the Romanos, the De Stefanos, a great many other Italian families who didn't want to do this. They didn't want to pay tribute in their businesses, and they were not about to be pushed around. And Grandpa had been a lieutenant in Abyssinia. They were tough guys. They were not easily pushed. So my mother told the story that one morning she was waken up by Vilma and taken out to the back door of their house to the garage, and a black powder bomb, whatever that is, blew the front of their house off at 2929 Washington Boulevard. So of course then Potter Palmer got involved. They got the Pinkerton guards, who were paid thugs, but they never had any trouble again from the Black Hand, nor was there any trouble building the hospital. Also, the Italian priests at Pompeii were also fierce. about not being intimidated. And the other thing is that in Italy, it's sort of regional. Italy was just becoming a nation. So the Sicilians, nobody was about to put up with it. The Neapolitans and the Tuscans and the Genovese, they were not about to be pushed around by the Sicilians. So the whole thing was regional as much as it was the good guys against the bad guys. So Grandpa founded the White Hand Society. The nuns did very, very well there, and they are still doing very well. And now they've all been to business school in Rome, so they really know their stuff. And tragically, they're not interested in America anymore. They work in the third world. So Columbus closed and Mother Cabrini Hospital closed. And the property is still there, and we don't know what's going to happen to it. The shrine is still there, too. And fascinatingly enough, I think Mother Cabrini's fibia is up at Columbus Hospital in the shrine, and her bedroom is there. And it's they recreated, her bedroom was there, but they recreated her bedroom. The amazing thing I found as I went through some of these things about my grandfather and about Mother Cabrini is they came to America and almost instantly wrote powerfully in English. I don't know how that was accomplished. They were absolutely eloquent. And people who knew them told me when I was a child that they certainly had heavy accents, but there was no problem understanding them. And I know the letters, we got some of the letters back when Jane Addams, when the Hull House was reconstructed, and we gave some letters that Jane Addams had written to Grandpa to the Hull House. And it was amazing to me that someone who was in another language, both Mother Cabrini and Grandpa, that they could write so easily and so quickly. And there are no strikeovers, you know, in English. They were penned letters that were just penned, and so apparently they did that. I doubt whether I could do that in Italian without a great deal of time spent. So they hit the deck running. I think they were extraordinary people. I think all the people who came to this country were they self-selected that they wanted to do something more, so they came here, they did this adventure, and they got here and they were ready for it when they arrived. So